Welcome to tonight's Terror, where you can expect original scary stories. Nothing here is written or narrated by AI. If you enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for visiting, and enjoy the story.
I could hear the Coyotes almost every night the summer before I started high school. They would gather in a pack across the road on some farmland hours after sunset. Their hoots and howls carried clearly through the rows of corn across the road and into my window on the second story of our house. I never minded hearing them. My dad had explained that they would never attack a person, and if I ever came across one, it would probably just bolt if I shouted and waved my arms. I said I heard them most nights, but I can't remember if they were howling in the cornfield the night before my dog died. After waking that July morning, I lay in bed, staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars stuck to my ceiling. I was wondering how long they glowed into the night before losing their charge and dimming out. I heard my parents talking in the hall. Their voices sounded strained and urgent, but they were trying to be quiet. Something was wrong. They waited until I'd eaten my bowl of cereal to tell me that Bugs, our black lab, had passed away in his sleep the night before. Looking back, I think they'd been preparing me for this for a while. Comments here and there about his age must have been intended to soften the blow when it finally arrived. "Can I see him?" was the first thing that came out of my mouth. I'm not sure why. I'd never had a pet die before. I guess a part of me didn't believe it could happen. My parents had exchanged looks with raised eyebrows. My mom shrugged. My dad said, "I don't see why not. He just looks like he's sleeping." I remember everything about that conversation at the breakfast table, but I cannot for the life of me remember what happened next. I'm sure my dad had taken me out to the garage where Bugs was surely lying, lifeless and quiet, in his bed beside the recycling bins. I'm sure that happened, but I can't actually remember seeing my dog. That afternoon, I leaned on a fence post near the boundary of our backyard. My dad was a few yards into the woods, digging a hole. He'd told me that he didn't need help, and I wasn't really helping. But I hadn't said anything to Bugs before he died. I hadn't even pet him the night before. I think I wanted to watch him buried, to feel some kind of finality. After 15 minutes or so of grunting and sweating, my dad carried Bugs to the ovular hole he'd made. Bugs was in a beige canvas bag that I'd never seen before. Had we always had that? Saving it for the death of a dog? It didn't take nearly so long to fill the hole back in. Soon, we were standing side by side, looking down at the patch of freshly turned earth. My dad surprised me, suddenly saying, "Goodbye, Bugs. We loved you." He turned to me, expectantly. I didn't speak. No urge to say goodbye or thanks for being a good dog rose in my chest. I didn't really feel like we'd just buried my dog. I know I heard the Coyotes that night. They were like maniacs, laughing and yipping for much longer than they usually carried on. Their calls were also louder, maybe closer to the house. I got out of bed and stepped to the window. I cautiously pulled aside the blind. In the instant my eyes could focus on the outdoors and the dim light of a single street lamp, I saw something. A low, indistinct shape on all fours. It was fast. It streaked across the road and into the cornfield before I could get a real look. I'd only heard them up to this point. I'd never seen a coyote before, but I was pretty sure I just had. It was dark and about the size of a dog. In the morning, I'd have to tell my parents how close they were coming to the house. I lay in bed, unable to sleep, my mind racing with thoughts about the animal I'd seen. I couldn't stop replaying that image of its shadowy form disappearing into the cornfield. Its speed was shocking. I'd never seen an animal go so fast. The coyotes had always been a distant curiosity, a noise in the night that I could ignore. But this felt different. I didn't like the idea that something wild and unpredictable had been so close to our house. I couldn't get back to sleep, not with their eerie yipping echoing around my head. I turned over and checked the clock. 11:06. I pushed the blankets off. My feet hitting the cool floor with a soft thud. I stood still, hesitant, listening for anything that might give me a sign of more activity outside. The house was silent, that kind of silence that only comes late at night, when everything, even the furniture, seems to be sleeping. It was a bit too quiet, though. The TV should have been on. My dad always stayed up late to watch David Letterman. I shuffled downstairs, expecting to find him slumped on the couch, with the familiar babble of the television in the background. But the living room was dark, the TV off, and the shades drawn like my dad would do before going to bed. "Dad?" I called timidly. No answer. I stepped farther into the room, an unfamiliar stillness hanging in the air. My dad had never gone to bed this early. I turned toward the kitchen and then paused, hearing a faint sound coming from the direction of the garage. At first, it was just a few thumps, as though something heavy had been dropped. My heart began to race. I took a slow step toward the door that led to the garage, half expecting my father to open it and step through any second. But he didn't. Something else happened. I froze as a sound reached my ears that had no business being in our living room. I heard a whimper. Faint, like the cry of an animal in distress. My mind immediately jumped to the coyote. Was there one stuck in the garage? I hesitated as I neared the door. The whimpering continued. The sound seemed to grow more frantic as I approached. My hand gripped the metal, and I was just about to turn the knob. The sound of the electric garage door caused me to leap back. I heard the motor hum loudly and the familiar sound of the metal wheels in their track as the door began to rise. I took a deep breath and turned the doorknob. I cracked the door open just enough to peek out. I couldn't understand what I was seeing, but it wasn't a wild animal. I pulled the door open and found myself face to face with my father, standing in the middle of the garage. He had a black plastic trash bag in his hand. Before saying anything, I scanned the garage looking for the animal that had been making noise. There was nothing out of place. It took me a moment to realize what my dad was doing. He was bagging up Bugs' old belongings. His blanket, bed, toys, and food bowls lay on the floor. The bag was already half full and sagging with other artifacts of my dog's long life. "Did you hear that?" I asked. "Hear what?" My dad responded casually. "There was an animal whining out here, wasn't there?" "No, I don't think so," he responded, returning to his work. He continued without looking up. "I was putting together Bugs' old things. I thought maybe we could donate some of it, but he really wore this stuff out, huh?" I didn't answer. I was having enough trouble processing the idea that Bugs was gone. I certainly wasn't ready to pore over his things. I wished I'd never come out here. I wished that chew toys and stuff were just gone in the morning. Looking back, it's easy to see that that's exactly what my dad was intending, bagging the things up under the cover of darkness long after I'd gone to bed. I think I saw a coyote in the yard just now. My dad, ever the unflappable parent, scarcely paused. Really? Huh. Well, let's get the garage door down. Shouldn't we do something? I said, a hint of pleading in my voice. If they keep coming into the yard, we can put out some noisemakers and mothballs, but I doubt we see another one. The garage door came down with a grinding squeal. I watched the driveway and front yard disappear behind it, squinting into the dark for another sign of movement. My dad walked me back upstairs and said goodnight. I lay for a long time listening for the coyotes, but they never came. The next morning began in much the same way the prior day had. Urgent, muffled voices down the hall. Tight-lipped smiles when I walked into the kitchen. Well, Bugs didn't die again, so what's going on? I thought. My mom put down her coffee and asked if I wanted to go out to breakfast. Her voice was full of sunshine, but I could tell she was nervous. I don't think they had had a lot of practice, but they weren't very good at hiding things from me. What's going on? I asked, my eyes cast down at the linoleum floor. I don't think I had it in me to look my mom in the eyes if she was going to lie to me. With a sigh, she looked at my dad, and he spoke. Something happened up by the woods last night. He paused, and I looked at him expectantly. He pressed on, clearly uncomfortable. I was spraying for poison ivy out there this morning, and I saw... He trailed off. With an effort, he began again. Bugs's grave was dug up. I guess I didn't dig deep enough. I'm really sorry. Racing to the end of his thought, he added, probably coyotes. The disorientation of the last 2 days was beginning to catch up with me. I wasn't thinking clearly. I shook my head and asked, so, where's Bugs? My parents looked at me like a kid who's lost his dog. Bugs is gone, my mom said. Her eyes were wet, and there was a note of real sorrow in her voice. I still hadn't cried over Bugs, and I didn't then. I stood and left the kitchen. Heading out through the garage into the backyard, I soaked my feet and ankles in morning dew. I crossed the grass of the backyard on a line toward the spot where we'd left him. The edge of the woods was cast in dark shadows at this time of day. I waited as my eyes adjusted. Then I saw the grave. It wasn't what I expected. The dirt wasn't tossed everywhere like I'd expect a pack of coyotes might have done. One solitary hole marred the surface of the earth, with dirt pushed aside and around it. There were paw marks all around. I studied them. It struck me that I didn't remember what Bug's paw mark looked like. These were obviously canine, but that was all I could say. Coyotes, I murmured to the listening trees. I stepped around the grave to look into the hole. It wasn't hard to see there was nothing down there now. I stood staring for a long time. A dog bark in the distance broke my concentration. I let out a long breath. Bye, Bugs, I whispered. Love you, buddy. Later that day, my parents took me to Blockbuster and let me rent whatever I wanted. My dad said I could stay up late and watch a few movies. If they were going to loosen up the rules and spoil me because Bugs had died, I wasn't going to say no. I was 13 after all. It was one of those deserts of the summer that you'd run into from time to time. For one reason or another, all your friends were out of town, and you just bummed around the house for days on end. Most of my friends were doing summer camps or vacationing with their families. This was before the internet and social media, so you never really knew where anyone was. Anyway, it would be fun to have a movie night to break up the monotony. But it turned out one of my friends was in town, because he called me from his house that night. "Hi, Mike," I said, genuinely happy to hear a classmate's voice. "Hey," he began brightly, "I just saw your dog." My heart fell into my stomach. After a moment, I managed, "What?" "Yeah, Bugs, right? I saw him running through the backyards in my neighborhood a few minutes ago." "No," I said flatly. "That's not possible." Then I added, "Unfortunately." "I'm pretty sure it was him," he pressed. "Black lab, blue collar?" "Yeah, he looked like that. But no, Mike, it wasn't him. Bugs died a few days ago. We buried him." I didn't go on to explain that grave-robbing coyotes had pulled him from his grave and likely eaten his body. That was not something I was ready to talk about. That still didn't even feel real. Suddenly I wanted nothing more than to not be talking to Mike about Bugs or anything else. "Sorry," he said meekly. "That sucks, man." "It's okay. I've got to go, though." "Later, Mike," I said, the phone already halfway to the cradle. I heard him still speaking as I hung up, something about, "That dog looked just..." The phone call left me feeling queasy. Over the next 2 hours, I sat staring through the TV as Caddyshack flickered off my glassy, unseeing eyes. The phone call, while well-meaning, felt cruel. I hadn't spent much time dwelling on it, but I missed Bugs. Mike, seeing this twin dog, felt like a twist of the knife when all I was trying to do was distract myself and move on. I had nightmares that night. Bugs was barking outside my window. I might not have remembered his paw print, but I could pick his bark out of 1,000 dogs. It was one of those dreams that you tear yourself from with a huge effort and become conscious in that instant between dreaming and waking. The last bark seemed to echo around my room, as if there'd really been a dog outside. I rolled around in bed, struggling to fall back asleep. It was hot. The humidity of the day had never really burned off. After an hour of tossing and turning, my sheets were twisted into a rope around my legs and waist. A scream broke the silence of the night, and I sat up in bed, my head turned to the window. I rushed to open the blind. At first, I couldn't see anyone. From this angle, I could see about 2 houses down the street. Then, at the very limit of my vision, in the corner of a neighbor's yard, I saw movement. Then, more screaming.